at 8 p.m. and midnight Eastern. Next, North Carolina State University professor Susanna Lee talks about the changing perception of who qualified for citizenship in post-Civil War America. She describes the legislation passed during that era and the debate about whether citizenship and voting privileges should be tied to loyalty to the Union, race, or gender. Her class is about an hour and 15 minutes.
Good afternoon. How are you all doing? So, as you know, I'm Susanna Lee. We're here today in my Civil War and Reconstruction class with these bright NC State students, and today we're talking about Reconstruction, and in particular we're talking about citizenship during Reconstruction and the remaking of citizenship during Congressional Reconstruction. So let's first review what were some of the main points that we talked about in last class. Yes, Robin.
We talked about the Wade-Davis bill and how it provided states with the process of restoration once like 50% of the whites agreed to the oath, which was a new oath compared to the amnesty and 10% plan. So it was like a different oath, and it was saying that they were unionists throughout the entire year, or throughout the entire war, instead of like the other plan where it was just like now they're a part of that side.
Well, so you see with presidential Reconstruction during the Civil War itself, so we talked about wartime Reconstruction, and we talked about Lincoln's 10% plan, which some radicals disagreed with because it seemed to allow too many former Confederates back into power. And so, as Robin mentioned, the Wade-Davis bill was seen as radicals' reaction to the 10% plan, and it was understood as a way to ensure, better than the 10% plan did, that that government would be in the hands of loyal men. Okay, what other points did we cover? Chase.
We learned Johnson's presidential plan, in which he basically returned political power to Confederate states without, to Confederates without any actual stipulations, and was met with resistance by Unionists in the South and freedmen.
So we talked about presidential Reconstruction under Johnson, and it seemed in many respects very lenient, right? So it returned to power former Confederates. There were few limitations on voting or holding office, right? And as we talked about, Andrew Johnson amnestied or pardoned all former Confederates by 1868. Brandon, you had a point?
I was just going to bring up with the meanings of freedom and how the African Americans and the whites had different meanings at the end of the war and what they wanted to get out of it. So we just discussed the two main meanings of what freedom meant to them.
Right, absolutely. And as Brandon pointed out last class, we were talking about freedom and to what extent freedom was actually in existence in 1865. And so we talked about the ways in which freedom was really very precarious, and it was something that was worked out in individual interactions between former slaves and former slaveholders. So that was a really very important point. Jackie, what did you want to add?
To go off Brandon, we also talked about the Black Code that was adopted by like some of the Southern government, and some details. Basically, they can't own lands. If some blacks were seen in the public without, like, I guess, work, they can be arrested and then put on, like, I guess, forced to work on public projects and things like that.
Right, absolutely. So this is really very important, the Black Codes, because the Black Codes, as passed by Southern legislatures under presidential Reconstruction, so these are some of the first acts that these restored governments do. And although many northern states were, of course, very discriminatory towards African Americans, what was different about these Southern Black Codes is that they were really very geared to keep African Americans, these newly freed black men and women, in positions of economic dependence. Right? And so this is really very significant because, as we talked about, many white Northerners, many Republicans viewed these Black Codes as an attempt to resurrect the institution of slavery in a new guise. Right? And then we very briefly talked about racial violence in the aftermath of the Civil War, the Memphis riot and the New Orleans riots, and those were attacks on black men and women, white Republicans, men who had been loyal to the Union cause during the Civil War. And this was another signal to Republican congressmen that it didn't really seem like former Confederates were going to peacefully recognize that they had lost the war and that freedom was a reality. So as we talked about last class, when Amron talked about, so we were talking a lot about the benefits of reconciliation, of bringing former Confederates back into the Union, but as Amron pointed out, what if former Confederates, once brought back into the Union, didn't abide by freedom, didn't recognize the freedom of their former slaves? And so Congressional Reconstruction was an attempt to reconstruct Southern society so that white Southerners, former Confederates, former slaveholders recognize the freedom of their formerly enslaved property. Okay, so what we're going to talk about today, as I mentioned, is Congressional Reconstruction, and in particular, how notions of citizenship change. So I have two cartoons I want you to look at first. What's the story being told here in these two cartoons? What's going on? Joseph.
All right. Well, it appears that, based on the title, "Shall I Trust These Men and Not This Man?" that this cartoon is, or the first cartoon on the left is meant to be a portrayal of, I guess, America as a woman, maybe accepting the Confederate States back into the Union, and then after granting them their rights, she's basically explaining to a wounded black Union soldier that he's just going to have to leave. She's not going to grant him equal rights to the men who actually he just fought against to save the Union.
Right, so it's a question here. Here you have calls to reestablish the Union, to let the former Confederate states and former Confederate citizens back into the Union, right? So we talked about this last class. And then the question is, shall I let in these former Confederates, right, who acted against the United States? But what about these men? These men who didn't commit treason, who didn't try to destroy the Union, these men who sacrificed for the Union cause. And so that's why it's really very significant here, as Joseph points out, that the character depicted in the second cartoon is a Union soldier, right? And not just any Union soldier. How does this picture indicate his sacrifice? How is the sacrifice indicated? Hunter.
It looks like he was wounded in battle, so he served for his country.
He's missing a leg. Right, absolutely. And so what you have during Reconstruction, and here in particular I'm really talking about the white Northern perspective, the Unionist perspective, you have a situation in which the supporters of the Union are really reconceptualizing the nature of citizenship. What happens is that in the antebellum era, access to the rights and privileges of citizenship, as we've talked about before, was really restricted by race and gender, right? But then what happened during the Civil War is that those who were considered to be the best citizens, best qualified for citizenship, best able to act as good citizens, white men in the South, what did they do? They were traitors. They tore the Union apart. And then you had black men who were, by virtue of being African American, by virtue of being enslaved, they were thought of as really the antithesis of citizens. But they fought for the Union cause. So you had this situation in which this notion of citizenship didn't seemed to be backwards. It seemed all messed up. And so what you have during the Civil War and Reconstruction is this reconceptualization of citizenship as particularly in the Union, particularly white Northerners and Westerners come to question their previous standards of citizenship. And you see an increased importance given to loyalty. Not necessarily race, but increasingly loyalty. And so loyalty causes this reconceptualization of citizenship. And you could also see, so you can see African American men making claims on citizenship on the basis of their loyalty, but it could also potentially upset the gender hierarchy as well, as women potentially could build upon their loyalty and stake a claim for full rights of citizenship, or what they understood as full rights of citizenship in the Union. So today I'm going to talk about shifts in understandings of citizenship in the context of several major components of Reconstruction as envisioned by its congressional Republican architects. So we're going to be talking about the Freedmen's Bureau, the Civil Rights Act, the 14th Amendment, Reconstruction Acts, the 15th Amendment, and then we're going to talk about the documents assigned for today. And through this discussion, I'm primarily going to focus on the majority opinion, so Republicans, and primarily the Republican consensus, as much as there was one. And I'm also going to show how congressional Republicans, in response to the intransigence of former Confederates that we talked about last class, experimented with loyalty as a replacement for race in their understandings of citizenship and in the ways in which they restricted access to the rights and privileges of citizenship during congressional Reconstruction. So first, the Freedmen's Bureau. As the Union shifted to accept emancipation as a war goal, Republicans were really very fearful that these slaves, soon to be former slaves, wouldn't have the capacity to act as free citizens. So as we've talked about through the course so far, very clearly we understand that most white Southerners didn't understand that people of African descent could act as free citizens, but we also talked about how many white Northerners and Westerners shared those views. And so during Reconstruction, as the Union starts shifting to embrace emancipation as a war goal, there's this fear, well, what happens after the war? And so the federal government has this commission that seeks to explore that question. What is the capacity of these African Americans for freedom and for citizenship? And one of the commission's recommendations is to create a bureau. And that's the idea underlying the Freedmen's Bureau. The full name is the Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands. And I stress that because it was understood as an institution that was overseeing the process from slavery to freedom, but it was also a relief agency for both white and black Southerners in the aftermath of the Civil War. We talk about it as the Freedmen's Bureau, but it was also an institution that assisted white Southerners as well. Now, the federal government created the Freedmen's Bureau in March of 1865 to assist in this process, to potentially prepare these former slaves for freedom and potentially also for citizenship. Republican supporters argued that freed people, after years of being enslaved, that they did not have the necessary self-reliance to act as free people. And so the Freedmen's Bureau was understood as this sort of temporary, because they wanted it to be temporary, a temporary means by which the federal government could assist in the process of transitioning from slavery to freedom. As one proponent argued, we have 4 million people in poverty because our laws have denied them the right to acquire property, in ignorance because our laws have made it a felony to instruct them, without organized habits because war has broken the shackles which bound them and has released them from the plantations. We are to organize them into society. We are to guide them as the guardian guides his ward for a brief period until they can acquire habits and become confident and capable of self-control. We are to watch over them, and if we do, we have from their conduct in the field and in the school evidence that they will more than repay our labor. If we do not, we will doom them to vagrancy and pauperism. So why did this congressman see the Freedmen's Bureau as necessary? Why did he think it was necessary to have some form of the federal government acting in former Confederate states? Yes, Landon, what do you think?
I believe it's because he didn't think that they were able or capable enough to do it themselves.
So he didn't think they were capable of transitioning to freedom on their own. And indeed, there were some Republicans who were critical of this paternalism, this sort of paternalistic assumption that without the assistance of whites, African Americans couldn't learn how to act as free citizens. So he says here that they don't presently have habits of self-control. They're not confident. So that's presuming that they are lacking in that regard and that the federal government needs to come in and assist them. Carrie, did you want to add something?
I feel like it's very much spoken from the perspective, or a similar perspective of a slaveholder. It's that paternalistic mentality that obviously has not disintegrated, even though the war is now over. So it's more than they're still viewed in the perspective or the lens of still being enslaved, and the war as being the only reason that they were bound from their shackles.
And so Carrie makes a good point there, showing the sort of similarity in some of the sort of racist assumptions underlying the Freedmen's Bureau. And I think that's really interesting, the way you kind of compare it to the perspective of a slaveholder, now former slaveholder, in the South. What's different here, though, in the white Republican thought, and so I think that's an important point that we often forget, but what I do want to point out is that what Republicans believe in, that many former slaveholders don't, is the idea of free labor. And so what you see and what we saw last class and what we'll see moving forward as we delve more deeply into Reconstruction is a resistance to free labor ideology. So there are differences, but there are also similarities. Aubrey, what do you want to add?
At least in the beginning, it sounds more like because he says our laws have denied them the right to do this and that. It sounds like it's more of the federal government's obligation to now integrate them into society because they were the ones that previously held them back from society.
Right, that's a really very important point. He's saying because of our laws, because we sanctioned the institution of slavery, we are complicit in what he considered to be their inferior position. So that's a really very smart point. And what he's establishing there is the obligation of the federal government to help raise them up, because the federal government had been complicit in the institution of slavery, and now the federal government should also assist in the transition from slavery to freedom. The restrictions built into the black codes and the violence towards former slaves that we talked about earlier this week convinced many Republican congressmen, as we talked about, that white Southerners really refused to recognize abolition, and they refused to treat black Southerners as free laborers and free citizens. Republican congressmen believed that it was necessary to guarantee to former slaves their civil rights so that they could be allowed, so that they had the tools to protect themselves from their former masters and mistresses. So Congress took steps to safeguard black civil rights in the Civil Rights Act of 1866. And this slide presents I think I've missed it. This slide presents an excerpt from the Act. The bill declared that anyone born in the United States, except Indians, were citizens with federally protected rights, including the right to make and enforce contracts, the right to own and rent property, and the right to access courts and parties as witnesses. Now, this act was really very revolutionary in that it, for the first time in the nation's existence, defined citizenship in national terms. Citizenship had always previously been defined on state terms. So this is a national expression of citizenship. And it was a national expression of citizenship regardless of race. Proponents saw the act as an expression of the federal government's responsibility to protect the fundamental rights of American citizenship. Now, the Republican consensus supported the Freedmen's Bureau and also supported equal civil rights for African Americans. Nevertheless, President Andrew Johnson, who had previously been a Democrat, so that explains some of the ways in which he was at odds with his nominal party, Johnson vetoed both an extension of the Freedmen's Bureau Act because, remember, it had initially been intended to only be temporary, and so Congress continually had to renew it when they thought that there was still a necessity for it. So he vetoed an extension of the Freedmen's Bureau Act, and then he also vetoed the Civil Rights Act. He argued that these congressional measures were unconstitutional because they represented augmentations of federal power, that they presumed to take upon, the federal government presumed to take upon powers and authority that had really been reserved for the states. He also argued that what these measures did was to give special handouts and protections and privileges to blacks at the expense of whites. So Johnson more specifically opposed the extension of the Freedmen's Bureau Act on the grounds that Congress had never before provided such privileges to our people, as he called them. What did that mean? What did he mean by our people? Who was he referring to?
The Confederates.
The Confederates? Okay. Who else? Who else was Andrew Johnson referring to by our people? What do you think, Landon?
Whites, in particular.
Whites. So more generally, the former Confederates, but also more generally, whites. He said, the federal government has never before offered these kinds of protections, this kind of assistance. Now, keep in mind, as I pointed out, the Freedmen's Bureau did provide for white Southerners as well as black Southerners, but he was, I think his perspective there is really very significant because it shows how what's going on here during Congressional Reconstruction was really a very profound shift. It's a shift in the notion of who constitutes our people, who is our people, right? So you see congressional Republicans who are trying to include African Americans into our people, and you see this resistance to it by people like Andrew Johnson and also Democrats who say, no, wait, this is a white man's government. Aaron, what did you want to say?
I don't think we actually touched on it, but I'm not quite familiar with the political process, and I was wondering how Johnson became president. I'm assuming he wasn't voted on, and he didn't play a part in Lincoln's presidency, so...
Well, this is a little known fact which many people are not necessarily aware of, but during the Civil War, we talked about the presidential election of 1864. Abraham Lincoln, the Republican candidate, didn't actually run under the banner of the Republican Party. He renamed the party, I think it was renamed the National Union Party, and it was renamed as a sort of attempt to create a coalition. And so, because think about it, the Republican Party had really just come into existence in the late antebellum era. And so Abraham Lincoln, during the Civil War, is trying to broaden his coalition, and Andrew Johnson was brought in as the vice presidential candidate because he was a Democrat, and so appealed to Democrats potentially, but also he had been loyal to the Union, and so it was thought he was brought in on the ticket even though he had not converted to the Republican Party as a means to broaden the coalition. Does that make sense? Okay. So Johnson, as I talked about, there was this attempt to restructure what our people meant. Now, Johnson didn't really see the Freedmen's Bureau as an attempt to for greater inclusion. He saw it as an example of favoritism. Here you have the federal government favoring African Americans at the expense of whites. And you see these arguments echoed here in a Democratic broadside from 1866, this idea that what the Freedmen's Bureau did was to allow black Southerners to just laze about, that it was giving them rations, giving them food, encouraging them to loaf about, and therefore, why would a former slave work if the federal government was just going to give him a handout? Johnson opposed the Civil Rights Bill because, as he contended, the distinction of race and color is by the bill made to operate in favor of the colored and against the white race. And he believed that blacks were incapable of acting as good citizens. Can it be reasonably supposed, he asked, that former slaves possess the requisite qualifications to entitle them to all the privileges and immunities of citizens of the United States? That was a question. He didn't really expect an answer because he thought it was just self-evident. Of course they could not act as good citizens. Congressional Republicans, however, ultimately passed the extension of the Freedmen's Bureau and the Civil Rights Act over Johnson's vetoes, and they moved to take control of the process of Reconstruction. Now, Republican congressmen, they feared that a hostile judiciary and potentially maybe a future Democratic majority in Congress would eventually subvert the Civil Rights Act. And so they intended the 14th Amendment, which was passed in 1866 and then ratified in 1868, as a means to place black civil rights and also citizenship on a firm constitutional footing. So as you see from this next slide, the 14th Amendment granted both state and a national citizenship to all black people who had been born in the United States. This is the concept of birthright citizenship. It had been in the news recently in the discussion of anchor babies, right? We've talked about this briefly before. And the 14th Amendment also prohibited states from enforcing any law which abridged the privileges and immunities of citizenship, prohibited states from depriving any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, and prohibited states from denying any person the equal protection of the law. This next slide presents the suffrage clause. Who can translate the legal language here? So this clause stipulated that representatives shall be apportioned among the several states according to their respective numbers, counting the whole number of persons in each state, excluding Indians not taxed, but when the right to vote at any election for the choice of electors for President and Vice President of the United States, representatives in Congress, the executive and judicial officers of a state, or the members of the legislature thereof, is denied to any of the male inhabitants of such state being 21 years of age and citizens of the U.S., or in any way abridged except for participation in rebellion or other crime, the basis of representation therein shall be reduced in proportion. What does that all mean? What does this clause provide for? Corinna?
Is it that each state will have representatives that are representative of the population?
Representative of the population of... Okay, so you're getting at it. You're getting at it here.
Isn't there a discrepancy of who is a whole number?
Right, so it has to do with the 3/5 federal compromise, right? Arbor, did you want to add something?
Even black men, they're each a person now and they're each counted, but they still don't have the right to vote. It's just white men have the right to pick the representatives of the state, even though the black men count as citizens of the state.
Right, so that is a factor. Do you want to add anything, Joseph?
Well, it kind of felt like what they were getting at was that anytime somebody wasn't permitted to vote, say on the case of race, then you lose, then the portion of the population that you're preventing from actually voting, you also lose in regards to your representatives.
Exactly. Right. So what's the problem here? The problem is that these former Confederate states, if they're admitted back into the Union, they'll actually have more political power than they did before, because African Americans will be counted not as 3/5 of a person, but as full persons. And so their representation in Congress would be increased accordingly. But yet at the same time, these former Confederate states didn't allow those men to vote. And so what this provision of the 14th Amendment did was to say, okay, if you're going to disfranchise black men, prevent them from voting, then you're not going to get congressional representation for them. Right? So it was a means by which Republican congressmen were attempting to reduce the potential political power of the former Confederacy without an outright enfranchisement of black voters. Right? Republicans, many of them were opposed to black suffrage. And so rather than forcing black suffrage upon the former Confederate states at this time, they chose to create this mechanism by which former Confederate states would have their representation docked. Okay? Will, did you want to ask something? Finally, this slide presents what's called the disabling clause. The 14th Amendment denied the privilege of holding office, but not voting, to a significant segment of the Southern political leadership. Republican congressmen intended this provision as a means to ensure that office holding was in the hands of loyal Southern men. The 14th Amendment, as I alluded to, stopped short of the radicalism that some Republicans envisioned. Radical Republicans preferred mechanisms that placed government in the hands of loyal Southerners, and they objected to the 14th Amendment because it did not explicitly enfranchise black men, and because it did not disfranchise former Confederates. Now, Republicans didn't establish black male suffrage in the 14th Amendment because they knew that it would be extremely unpopular, not just among the political opposition, the Democratic Party, but also within the Republican Party as well. Republican opponents cautioned that black men were not yet ready to vote, and maybe they wouldn't ever be ready to vote. And then Democratic opponents argued that African Americans were lazy, and they were stupid, and they were incapable of acting as citizens, and they therefore called for a white man's government. Now, Confederate disfranchisement also faced significant opposition from both Republicans and Democrats. What do you think were some of the arguments against Confederate disfranchisement? Why might Republican congressmen, or really any congressman, really be opposed to Confederate disfranchisement? What would be some of the opposition? Carrie, what do you think?
Would it be maybe that in order to possibly keep African Americans out of the system so much, if you will? I think when you're raising an important issue, right? And also, because they're still white men. So I feel like that holds precedence. And if you want to disenfranchise them for their past mistakes, that they're still white men with this whole loyalty to the white supremacy and a white man's government, you're going to face opposition by many, I feel.
Right. So especially Democrats are going to be opposed to disfranchising white men, particularly if you're thinking of potentially enfranchising black men, right? So there's that idea that this is a white man's government, and these are white men, and they're capable of acting as good citizens, and we should readmit them to the Union and restore them to their rights and privileges. Why else? Why else might congressmen oppose Confederate disfranchisement? So prohibiting former Confederates from voting. What do you think, Matthew?
You would be virtually alienating them while you're trying to get the country back together. You're going to have a bunch of people who you've taken away their right to vote. They're not going to be happy about that, and they might try to start up another rebellion or something like that that's going to give you a lot of grief while you're trying to put a torn country back together.
Right, so the opposition of those disfranchised, right? So there's the white Democratic opposition in the North and also the West, but then also the opposition of those disfranchised as well. And then also think about it, as we talked about, during the Civil War, there was a white Unionist population, right? But it was a minority of the white Southern population. And so if you disfranchise former Confederates, then essentially what you're creating is a government of the minority, right? And one of the foundational principles of the American experiment in republicanism is rooted in the consent of the governed. And if you're disfranchising former Confederates, they are not consenting to their government. They're not allowed to participate. And so not just Democratic opponents, but also Republican opponents complained that Confederate disfranchisement was essentially unrepublican, that it was not legitimate. And they were very wary of disfranchising really a significant proportion of the population. I also want to add, right, so Democrats also, in addition to the arguments that we've already mentioned, Democrats also contended that former Confederates had sworn oaths of loyalty. They had sworn that they would support the Union in the future. They had returned to their loyalties in good faith. And so the argument among Democrats was that they are now loyal citizens. They have sworn to be loyal in the future, and so they should not be discriminated against. As one Democratic put it, the people of the South, once rebels, are rebels no longer. Republican congressmen really hesitated to impose on an arena that had traditionally been the province of states, right, voter qualifications, especially to impose what would have been very unpopular policies. Still, the 14th Amendment was a powerful and revolutionary expression of equality written into the Constitution. In the antebellum era, as we talked about briefly, the Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court had declared that blacks were so inferior and so unfit to associate with the white race that they could justly and lawfully be reduced to slavery for their own benefit, and that they had no rights that a white man was bound to respect. Slaves had lacked all civil standing. They had not been able to vote. They had not been able to sue. They had not been able to testify against whites. They had not been able to receive justice for assault, for rape, or for murder. And so the 14th Amendment was revolutionary in that it declared that these former slaves were citizens of the United States. So Republican congressmen had succeeded in establishing African Americans as citizens, had provided protections to black civil rights, had provided incentives for black male suffrage, if not black male suffrage itself. Most Republican congressmen would have been willing to end Reconstruction there. However, white Southerners, encouraged by President Johnson, refused to ratify the 14th Amendment, and at the same time, violence towards black men and women, and also violence towards white unionists, continued throughout the South. The New Orleans race riot occurred soon after Congress passed the 14th Amendment, and these actions really convinced many moderate Republicans to shift to embrace more radical measures. As one Republican complained, they would not cooperate in rebuilding what they destroyed, so we must remove the rubbish and rebuild from the bottom. We must compel obedience to the Union and demand protection for its humblest citizen. Republican congressmen then proceeded to impose further conditions on the former Confederacy in the form of the Reconstruction Acts of 1867 and 1868. These acts, as you see on the slide, placed the former Confederate states, with the exception of Tennessee, which had passed the 14th Amendment, under military occupation. It created 5 military districts that would be overseen by generals in the Army. It also provided for, and then also, so, right, what the Military Reconstruction Acts did was to divide the former Confederacy into these military districts under the command of the Army, and it also declared all of the governments created under presidential Reconstruction, under Johnson, the ones that passed the black codes that we talked about earlier, it declared them provisional only. Right, so what the Reconstruction Acts of 1867 and 1868 did was to provide for a process to create new state governments, to overturn the state governments that had just recently been created under presidential Reconstruction, but to recreate them on a loyal basis. And it did this in a couple of ways. So you see there on the slide the last 2 items, right? So this is a process for creating new state governments in the former Confederacy, and this process was different. This process under the Reconstruction Acts was different than what had happened before under presidential Reconstruction, because under the Reconstruction Acts, loyal men would be involved. Loyal men would vote in elections. Loyal men would vote for delegates to new constitutional conventions. Loyal men would serve as delegates to these new constitutional conventions. And at the same time, former Confederates not all former Confederates, but high-ranking former Confederates, those who were disabled by the 14th Amendment, which we just talked about. Those former Confederates were prevented from participating in the process of creating these new state governments. So they were not allowed to participate. So you had the participation of loyal men regardless of race. So white men could participate, but also black men could participate. So this is black male enfranchisement overnight in their participation in the creation of these new state governments. Corinna, did you want to ask a question?
It just seems very extreme to me because I feel like such a big pillar in the United States is the right to choose and have these decisions of what you believe in and like voting for what you believe in, and it just seems like they're taking away everyone who doesn't agree or doesn't claim loyalty to the government. So it just seems very extreme, and it doesn't seem right.
It seemed very extreme to some opponents at the time as well. Amron, what did you want to add?
I was going to say that, it was even more extreme for the Confederates to remove themselves from the United States because they didn't agree with the other politics. So I feel like it's just in treating them this way because they were trying to step outside of it, and cause a war over it.
And so maybe some congressional Republicans saw this extreme measure, which it was recognized at the time as being extreme. They saw this sort of unprecedented measure as justified in an attempt to deal with the sort of calamities of the Civil War. So, I mean, as you point out, right, it seems antithetical to our foundational principles, as I talked about earlier, of the consent of the governed, right? But then what does that mean for African Americans? They are governed too. And under presidential Reconstruction, they weren't able to participate in the political process, right? Does that make sense? So what congressional Republicans were attempting to do, and so they thought of it as temporary. They wanted these governments to be loyal. They wanted them to have a loyal basis, and they wanted them to be created by loyal men. But the Reconstruction Acts didn't require these new state governments, these new state constitutions, to disfranchise Confederates forever. They just didn't want them to participate in the process of creating these new governments. And they wanted to do that because they wanted to, even though it seems contradictory, they wanted to create this Republican form of government in which white men and black men could participate. Does that shed a little bit of light? Okay. Now, a Republican commitment to the significance of wartime loyalty contributed to support for black male suffrage that culminated in the Reconstruction Acts and then also, as we'll talk about, the 15th Amendment. Some Republicans favored citizenship and its attendant rights and privileges for black men as a fulfillment of their political obligations to the Union, most particularly through their military service as Union soldiers. One Republican praised the brave colored men who heroically bled in defense of their country, a country from which thus far they have received injuries rather than blessings. The actions of white Southerners during the Civil War and under presidential Reconstruction convinced most Republican congressmen that black patriots made better citizens than white traitors, as they understood them. As one Republican put it, loyal men of whatever color have more right to the ballot than have disloyal men, however white they may be. Even Republicans who were doubtful of the merits of black suffrage expressed this opinion. So, for example, one Republican said, well, I'm not sure that black men are ready for the vote, but I am positive that white men are not ready for the vote. So this kind of goes again to your point, Corinna. It's this: they didn't believe that former Confederates would recognize the freedom of these African American men and women. And they thought they therefore temporarily needed to be disfranchised, because otherwise these former slaves would be put back into positions of subordination. And they already saw that with the black codes, and they also saw that with all of this violence towards African Americans, right? As African Americans are seeking to make something meaningful of their freedom, they are facing resistance from white Southerners. So this congressman put it, "If I am asked which I would sooner trust, I would answer that I would prefer to trust the meanest black man with a loyal heart who wore the chains of slavery to the most intelligent traitor who has waged war against my country." So in these ways, you see Republican congressmen who were shifting away from racial capabilities toward loyalty as the qualification for exercising the full rights and privileges of citizenship. Continued white Southern intransigence convinced many Republicans that former Confederates, as I've been talking about, couldn't be trusted to act as good citizens. Republican congressmen feared that if these rebels were allowed to participate in the creation of these new governments, again, that what they would do is they would hold all of the power. They wouldn't bring black men in, and they would continue to oppress and tyrannize black Southerners and also white Unionists throughout the South. As one radical Republican urged, "Do not admit those who have slaughtered 500,000 of our countrymen until their clothes are dried and until they are reclad. I do not wish to sit side by side with men whose garments smell of the blood of my kindred." So there was this notion that these men had proven themselves to be bad citizens. They needed to be reclad. They needed to be remade and kept out of the Union until they were ready to act as good citizens and recognize the freedom of African American men, women, and children. The Reconstruction Act provided a process to replace state governments then in the hands of disloyal Southerners with new state governments that would be in the hands of loyal Southerners, both white and black. The Reconstruction Acts ensured that these new state governments in the former Confederate states would enfranchise black men, but still there was this fear among congressional Republicans that black male suffrage was precarious. They feared that that future Democratic majorities would disfranchise black men. And they were also concerned about white Southern intimidation of black voters throughout the South. That's a subject we're going to talk about next week. And so Republican congressmen sought to provide a constitutional guarantee for black male suffrage in the 15th Amendment. As this slide shows, the 15th Amendment, as passed by Congress in 1869 and then ratified by the states in 1870, established racially impartial, if not universal, suffrage. States could reject voters on any factor other than race, color, or previous condition of servitude. So this left open the possibility that states could disfranchise on the basis of literacy, for example. And so this is going to be significant, as we'll talk about later. For many Republicans, black Southerners' wartime loyalty opened up space to consider their fitness for citizenship and its rights and privileges. Black loyalty didn't convince congressional Republicans entirely, but it opened up the possibility. It alerted them to the possibility that black men could act as good citizens. And it was pragmatic considerations that really cinched their claims. So as we talked about earlier, ironically, with the abolition of the institution of slavery, former Confederate states had greater political power. And so black male enfranchisement was thought of as a way in which congressional Republicans could counterbalance former Confederate votes. So it was thought necessary. If you're not going to disfranchise former Confederates permanently, if you're going to allow them to participate in the political process, congressional Republicans wanted to counterbalance their political influence with black votes, which they thought they were fairly certain that black men would vote for the Republican Party. In addition, many Republicans thought that black suffrage would end Reconstruction because they thought that what it would do would invest black men with the power to protect their own rights. If they were able to vote, then they would be able to protect their own rights, and then the federal government wouldn't have to continue to intervene in Southern affairs, right? So if we think about this again, the Republican Party was a sort of coalition. You had of a variety of different people with different political positions, and so many Republicans were really very hesitant to continue to require federal intervention, and so you had many Republicans sort of shying away from permanent federal power and permanent federal intervention in the South. Democratic opponents of black male voting dismissed Republicans' tribute to black loyalty. Some insisted that black men's contribution to the Union cause had been insignificant. One Democratic congressman asserted they did not win their freedom. They had but little agency in shaping the events which conferred it upon them. It came to them as one of the results of a great civil war in which white men contended for power and in which colored men played but a subordinate part. Why did this congressman, this Democratic congressman, think that slaves' little agency, the fact that, in his opinion, they had little role in emancipation, why did he consider that important? Why was that significant? So he thinks that they didn't play any role in emancipation. It was just something given to them. Why is that significant from his perspective? What do you think, Matthew?
Well, his overall argument seemed to be that a lot more white soldiers died during the Civil War than black soldiers. I don't think black soldiers were even enrolled in the Army until later in the war. So he seems to be arguing that a lot of white soldiers basically bought their freedom for them with their lives.
So white soldiers, right? White soldiers sacrificed and blacks didn't. Corinna, what did you want to add?
Maybe that we gave you your freedom, so why should we give you more?
Right, so it's this idea, we gave you your freedom, you didn't act for it. And so within that is this idea that black men couldn't act as citizens. You had all these white men on the battlefield who were fighting for their beliefs, fighting for their country. But he's saying that black men didn't really participate. Their freedom was given to them. I mean, and implicit in that is the idea that maybe they didn't even really want their freedom. They didn't really know what to do with it. And so, I mean, I think this is one of the reasons why our conversation over who freed the slaves is really very significant, because this Democratic congressman is saying, well, the slaves, I mean, the idea of slaves freeing themselves would have never even occurred to him, but he's saying that they had no role in emancipation. And to him, implicit in that is the idea that they can't really act as citizens. You had white men who acted as citizens during the war. And black men, they were just given their freedom. So here, the idea that black men didn't participate in their own emancipation for this Democratic congressman was a powerful justification for their continued disfranchisement, for the continuation of policies that prevented them from voting and holding office. Women didn't benefit from this shift to wartime loyalty in the expansion of suffrage. Women's rights activists hoped that they could capitalize on this new emphasis on loyalty to push for female suffrage. One supporter observed, the women did not go to the battlefield with muskets and bayonets in their hands, but they did render services at home during the war equally as valuable as fighting. And so they use that as an argument to say, we're loyal citizens, we deserve the right to vote. Corinna, did you have a question?
Well, in our reading, the questions that they asked women, one of them was not...
We're going to get there.
Oh, okay.
Okay. So Republican congressmen, however, were not convinced that women's contributions had been sufficient to overcome presumptions of their natural domesticity. As one opponent put it, women cannot bear their share of the public burdens. Men represent them in the Army and the Navy. Therefore, men represent them and vote for them in the government. Republican congressmen that argued that blacks needed the protection of the vote Whereas women didn't need that protection because women were already protected by their husbands and fathers who voted for them on their behalf. So what you see here is that loyalty mattered for black men, but didn't matter for white women or black women for that matter either. So as I've discussed so far, loyalty really assumed greater importance during the Civil War and Reconstruction, but loyalty was difficult to pin down. How do you define loyalty? As we've discussed so far, some politicians define loyal men as men who swore an oath of loyalty in the future to the Union, right? So that included former Confederates. But then you had other people who defined loyal men as those who swore an oath of loyalty that stipulated that they had been loyal in the past and would also continue to be loyal in the future. And that, of course, only included Unionists and excluded Confederates. So there's this difference of opinion about what constituted loyalty. Now, loyalty wasn't defined solely by politicians, and that's why I have the documents assigned for you today, so that we can look at how Southerners themselves defined loyalty. The primary sources assigned for today allow us to examine the different definitions of loyalty, and we're looking at records from the Southern Claims Commission. Who could summarize what the Southern Claims Commission did? What did the Southern Claims Commission do? What was it established to do? It's an easy question. I know y'all know. Max?
It was a commission. They awarded monetary compensation to Southerners who could prove that they've been loyal to the United States and to the Union.
Right. So it was recognizing their rights to their property only to loyal citizens, and if you proved that the Union Army had taken your property and that you were loyal to the Union, you could get monetary compensation. Bailey, did you want to add something?
Weren't they like specially appointed people to go around and interview citizens? I just thought that was interesting because to do that back then was such a task, I guess, and to try to decipher who's being truthful and who's just trying to get money.
It's a big task, right? And I think, and I'm glad that you point out the appointment of these people throughout the South, because those people are representatives of the federal government, and so former Confederates were really very opposed to them. It was, within their communities, they would have these special commissioners, as they were called, who were representing the interests of the commission, and they were personifying the federal government. And not only were they representatives of the federal government, but they were rewarding these loyal Southerners who, right, loyal Southerners, if you're a former Confederate, were actually disloyal Southerners, right? So loyalty really depended on the perspective. Okay, so let's look at some of these claims. Let's talk about Reuben Garland. What was the deal with Reuben Garland? What's his story? What did he claim? What did the commissioners think about him? Abra?
Is this the first guy?
Yes.
I think this was the one where he discussed aiding his uncle monetarily, and I think he claimed he didn't do that much, but he did admit to helping his uncle, who was a part of the Confederate.
He was in the Confederate military.
Mm-hmm. So I think that was relevant. At least he was honest, but then I think at the end it was like, oh, sorry, it's not granted. I'm pretty sure.
Okay, yes. So he had assisted the Confederate cause, and the commissioner said, well, you assisted the Confederate cause. You're not loyal. Why did Reuben Garland think that he had a claim as a loyal citizen? Why did he apply then? If he had assisted the Confederate cause, the commissioners disallowed his claim. Why did he think that he qualified as loyal? What do you think? Joseph?
A large part of what he claims is that he didn't do anything to directly support the Confederacy. So, he claims that he had bonds that he received in trade, but he didn't buy them directly himself. He also had passes that, I'm assuming they were like travel passes, that he was granted to go and continue with his company, but he didn't swear an oath of allegiance or anything like that to the Confederacy, and he didn't really, or he claims not to have operated his company to benefit the Confederacy itself.
So he didn't really see his contributions to the Confederacy as very significant, and so he understood himself as not really a sort of real devoted Confederate, right? Why else might he have considered himself loyal? Well,
he voted against secession, too.
So he initially voted against secession. So he had initially been opposed to secession, right? So yes, he did later, in some ways, offer support to the Confederacy, but he didn't. But he had initially been opposed to secession. And this really distinguished him from those who were original secessionists, those who had supported secession right from the outset. Right? So these are distinctions that are being made in the South, right? Reuben Garland didn't consider himself a Confederate like his neighbors who had advocating for secession in the secession crisis with the election of Abraham Lincoln, right? He had been opposed to secession, and so therefore he understood himself as a loyal citizen. And these are distinctions that the federal government in the form of the Southern Claims Commission were not making. They weren't recognizing them. So I think that shows there some of the divisions of opinion about over loyalty. Aubrey, were you going to add anything?
Oh, yeah, just going on that, he mentioned that kind of in defense of himself, he said, I only went with it because my state did. So I think it made it seem like he was more tied to his state's loyalty, and he felt obligated to go because of his state, but it kind of made it seem like he was saying that in defense of himself, since he wasn't an original secessionist.
Right, so it's interesting that phrase, which you hear frequently, or you read frequently, if you read Confederates' explanation of their positions during the Civil War, that they went with their state. And essentially what that's saying is that they have operated in obedience to the constituted government around them, right? So that is really expressing, emphasizing that he had acted as a citizen. He had followed the dictates of his state. What did you want to add, Caroline?
Well, in addition to that, the Claims Commission almost seems like they weren't just looking for people that were going along with everyone around them or going along with their state or voting at the beginning. They were looking for people who were standing out and who were actively fighting against the Confederacy to award them the monetary value of what they had lost. And so it wasn't just, if you lost something here, you can get it back. It was, if you actively tried to help us during the war, then we are willing to compensate you.
Right, absolutely. So Caroline makes a really important point here. She's saying that what the commission, the commission was seeking to reward people who had done something. So think about this in the context of our conversation about citizenship. The claims commissioners were looking for people who had acted as good citizens, people who had stood up and said, no, secession is wrong. People who had resisted Confederate conscription, people who had enlisted in the Union Army. They were looking for people who had acted as good citizens and resisted these treasonous actions of Confederates, right? So they were looking for people who had fulfilled their obligations to the Union. And Reuben Garland, even though he had opposed secession, he wasn't their idea of a loyal citizen. What about John Hawke? He's the one who mentioned the pardon. What is John Hawke? What's John Hawke's argument? Why does he say he's loyal? Matthew.
He got a presidential pardon, and didn't he take an oath of loyalty to the Union after the war?
Yes, so he took an oath of future loyalty to the Union. And so there you see the Democratic position that once a former Confederate takes an oath of loyalty to the Union, the slate is wiped clean. He should be forgiven for past transgressions against the Union. John Hawke argues that he's loyal because, he might have acted on behalf of the Confederacy, but he took an oath of allegiance, and he had returned to his loyalties in good faith. Once a rebel no longer, because he had sworn this oath of allegiance to the Union. And the commissioners looking at this, they're just outraged. This is a man who had been a Confederate, and now he's saying that he's a loyal Southerner, loyal to the Union. This man who had supported the Confederacy. So they're really outraged by this idea that these Confederate men are now calling themselves loyal Southerners. What about Nancy Hancock? What's going on with Nancy Hancock? I know you wanted to say something about Nancy Hancock. Go ahead, Corinna.
Well, it didn't really matter what she did. It kind of mattered what her husband did, because they asked her, I think, let me try and find it. They had a different set of questions for women, and it was kind of like, what did your husband do during the war? What did he contribute to the Union Army? It wasn't really reflective of the woman herself.
Right. So the commissioners seem very intent on figuring out whether or not her husband was loyal rather than whether or not she was loyal. Bailey, what did you want to add to that?
I think it kind of points out that they're looking for the, I guess, the man's contributions to the war. He mentions the son was volunteered for the army but was never taken. So they always focus on the sons and what the husband and the son did, but it was really never about her. And so since the husband and the son had passed, they didn't get much.
Right, so they were focusing on the husbands and the sons, right? And why? Why are they focusing on the husbands and sons? Because they see the sort of quintessential act of a loyal citizen as military service or voting, right? And women can't do that. And so when they're assessing this woman's loyalty, her capacity to act as a loyal citizen, she could never offer any kind of evidence that they really regarded as definitive because of her position within society. And so it's really interesting. In the commissioner's decision within the case, they say, what do they say at the outset? They say at the outset, well, the loyalty of her husband doesn't really matter at all. And we determine that Nancy Hancock is loyal, and then they proceed to talk all about her husband and how her husband had been loyal, even though they just said that his loyalty didn't really matter. But they focused on his loyalty because because they understood her as acquiring her loyalty through her husband. She didn't have necessarily loyalty in her own right. She acquired her loyalty from her husband because she couldn't act in the ways in which they expected of a loyal Southerner. What about Joseph Bacon? How did he claim his loyalty, and what did the commissioners think about him?
His loyalty because they just assumed that previous slaves sympathized with the Union. So, and he couldn't, there wasn't anything he really could do to support the Confederate or the Union cause.
Because he had been a slave, right? And so, and how did you conclude that the commissioners just assumed that he had been loyal?
Well, it says that they believed that former slaves often.
Oh, so it said it in the preface. All right, that is a good conclusion, right? And then also, if you look at their explanation as to why they found Joseph Bacon, who had been a slave during the Civil War, if you look at the commissioner's explanation of their decision, they ruled him loyal. And that's all they say. He's loyal. The evidence proves it. Whereas in all the other examples of claims that she looked at, the commissioner said, well, he's loyal or he's disloyal or she's loyal or disloyal because of this, this, and this. This is the evidence. But for Joseph Bacon and many other black Southerners, the commissioners just assumed that they were loyal by virtue of their enslaved status. They didn't expect much of them. Karina, what did you want to add?
But if women couldn't hold office and couldn't vote and they weren't citizens and their husband's views reflected onto them, why wouldn't it be the same for slaves? Because they also couldn't vote. They also weren't equally considered citizens, so why wouldn't their master's actions or beliefs reflect onto them?
Well, that's interesting. So in some situations, the commissioner said, well, this slave's master was disloyal, and we think the slave sympathized with his master. So sometimes that did happen. But for the most part, the commissioners believed that African Americans sympathized with freedom, that they understood that the Union cause would bring them their freedom, and they therefore supported the Union cause. For the most part, that was just their assumption. So they understood, for the most part, the master-slave relationship not as one that was harmonious, right? Not in the way in which slaveholders understood their relationship, right? The commissioners didn't believe that slaves understood their masters and mistresses as a sort of benevolent patriarch right? So the commissioners understood the master-slave relationship as one that was adversarial, and that the slaves didn't agree with their masters and mistresses. Okay, so let's look at a couple of claims, a couple of additional examples, right? So you have a sense of how the Southern Claims Commission operated. Let's look at a couple of examples. So, as we've talked about, you have Southerners who have definitions of loyalty that differed quite significantly from these commissioners. And then you had these commissioners who, as Caroline pointed out, really understood evidence of loyalty that was sort of centered on these sort of masculine acts, these expressions of their citizenship, military service, and voting. Let's look at a couple of examples. So we have an example from a white man named Peter McArdle. He was illiterate. He argued, this is from his testimony, I don't remember voting. I don't think I did vote. I tell you just how it was. I didn't know what to do. I felt that it was bad for the country. I was in favor of peace. I didn't care 1 cent so we could have peace. I was a poor man. I had to earn my living, and the war made it hard on me. I seemed too much to be willing to help the rebels. I would have helped the United States if called on as far as I could. If I had to fight, I would have helped the North if I had an opportunity. I expect I spoke often against the Union cause. I did against both sides. I hadn't much sympathy for the men that brought on the war or for them that was killing and shedding blood. So how do you think the commissioners ruled in this case? Think about Caroline's point. How do you think that they ruled? Caroline, think about your point. How do you think they ruled?
I would say they denied it because he didn't actively try and fight for the Union or anything, and it looks like he didn't want any part of the war from either side. So why would they say you're a loyal citizen if really you just didn't want it at all?
Right, absolutely. So they think at best he's neutral. That's what they decided, right? So they say you didn't fight for your country, and you don't even know if you voted. I don't think you're a good citizen. That's essentially what the commissioners thought. So they ruled against him. And moreover, they just thought he was very ignorant, that he didn't know anything about what it meant to be a citizen. Okay, we have another example. A woman, Eliza Clark. I lived in a secluded place. I had no connection in either army. As a woman, I took no part whatever in the war. I could see nothing to be gained by secession but an endless series of secession. I was therefore opposed to it as well as to the war. I never did anything to help the Confederate cause or hurt the Union. I would have been willing to contribute to the success of the Union so far as my means and circumstances would permit. What do you think the commissioners ruled? You think no, Corinna, why?
She didn't do anything.
Didn't do anything, right? So here, Eliza Clark is saying, I'm a woman. I took no part in the war, right? She's basically saying, what evidence do you expect of me? I didn't have a political position. I was a woman. I still am a woman. And she said, well, I would have contributed to the Union as befitted my means and circumstances, as would have been appropriate for a woman. The commissioners, yes, ruled against her because she had not contributed to the Union cause. Yeah, Amran, what do you want to say?
To account her husband, or did she not have one? Or
I don't remember for her. She probably did not have evidence. I think she's a widow. Her husband had died. And she didn't present, maybe if she had been able to present evidence that her husband had been loyal, but that really wouldn't have overcome the fact that she said, I didn't really have a role. So her husband, even if her husband had proven that he was loyal, they wouldn't have viewed her as loyal because she didn't explicitly express a political opinion. Really quick, go ahead.
If they would have done this in the North, in the Union, wouldn't they have had to get rid of a lot of citizens because a lot of people wouldn't have actively played a role?
So women were considered citizens, but they weren't considered citizens on par with white men. White men were considered better citizens because they could act on behalf of their government.
I mean, generally, if they were proving loyalty or disloyalty, and they did this not only in the South,
right,
but also in the Union, wouldn't they?
White women wouldn't have been able to present the loyalty that they wanted either, the evidence.
In general.
Unless they I think that is accurate because because not as many people in the North, I mean, not everyone had a direct role in supporting the war effort, right? So that's an excellent point. That, these standards would have been perhaps tough for many white Northerners to meet as well. And so what's really kind of interesting about this conversation, I think, about the Southern Claims Commission, is that it really highlights how some white Northerners, even Republicans, start to become really very skeptical of loyalty as a clear indication of who made a good citizen. You have all of these Southerners who appear before the commission who say, I was a good, loyal citizen, and yet they had supported the Confederacy. They had enlisted in the Confederate Army. They had served for 3 years. They had accepted positions in Confederate civil service. They had bought Confederate bonds. So these Republicans look at these Southerners and become really very skeptical of these claims to citizenship. And so what I want to emphasize here is how, for many Republicans, although you have this amazing experiment in which they reconceptualize citizenship on a loyal basis as a way to include black men as full citizens invested with the right to vote and hold office, by the end of the 1870s, there's a real skepticism of loyalty, that they see that there are all these different definitions of loyalty, and that the people who actually could prove themselves as loyal were actually not the best citizens, right? They were people who hadn't really been involved in the war. And so they become really very skeptical of loyalty as a means to limit the rights and privileges of American citizenship. But in this brief experimental period that was congressional Reconstruction, you see an attempt, right? So you see this attempt to bring to power loyal Southern men who had sacrificed for the Union cause and to displace disloyal Southern men who had sought to destroy the Union. Congressional Reconstruction brought about this tremendous transformation in Southern society in which black men who had recently been slaves were suddenly invested with political power. They could vote, they could hold office, and they had just been considered slaves. It's a profound transformation. And at the same time, you had white men who had been disfranchised, or not disfranchised, but politically marginalized under antebellum society. People who had been, who had not had the opportunity, had not been politically empowered, had been marginalized in this slaveholders' republic. They too are brought to power during Congressional Reconstruction. But as we'll talk about, Congressional Republicans sort of pull back from this radical experiment as loyalty increasingly seems an inadequate means to judge who makes a good citizen. All right, I will see you all next week. Look for an announcement from me on the reading assignments. I will send an announcement around on email. If you have any questions, let me know. You all have a good weekend.
Join us each Saturday evening at